Thank you all very much for coming along this morning. It's wonderful to see you all. Thanks for coming to our headquarters, the Sunday Times' office. And thanks very much to Gorkana for taking the time and effort to organise a really good turnout. Now, as they used to say at the London Palladium, we have a star-studded lineup for you. 4 fantastic speakers and a special guest star. Martin Ivins, editor of the Sunday Times, has come along this morning just to give us a few words to send us on our way. Martin, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you for coming to see us, to our old magnificent headquarters and this wonderful view of London. We hope, rather like our prospects, the view's going to get even better. We're shortly moving into the area near London Bridge, right next to the Shard, in our new fantastic offices. I'd like to say just a couple of words about the newspaper. I mean, it may sound like a statement of the obvious, but we are the biggest selling serious newspaper in this country, and we have the most prestigious business section, I think, of any quality newspaper, bar none. It also, some of you may not realise, has twice the readership of the Financial Times. We are very easily the market leader in business news. I'd just like to reinforce that with the stories you're reading at the moment. Are very much in the financial area, are often generated here. I mean, the last couple of weeks we've all been reading about AstraZeneca. Well, news of that bid, probably the highest takeover attempt in the history of British finance, was broken here at the Sunday Times by Ben Marlow, one of our journalists, and on a hunch pushed by the whole financial team, ably steered by Dominic O'Connell. But that wasn't a sort of a black swan, an extraordinary event. That was rather typical of what we do here. Dominic's team also in recent times have broken the 3rd biggest takeover attempt in the world, that of Vodafone and Verizon. So it gives you some idea of the range of what we do. It's a great moment, I think, for us to celebrate that achievement. The creation of the Sunday Times business section itself was thought to be an extraordinary event in its time, 50 years ago. Nobody, I think, then thought, that a newspaper that perhaps better known for its serializations, its literary content, would be able to be a path maker in business news in the way we have. But we did, and it's an extraordinarily rich tradition. It's also a key moment for business now. We're coming up into perhaps one of the most exciting periods of political history I've come across. I'm a former political commentator, one that crucially concerns business. For some, the stakes seem to be very high indeed. As you'll know, we're coming up to the European elections. We've got the Scottish referendum in September, which may mean the end of this country as we know it. That 300 years of union may suddenly go. And that has vast implications for a whole host of businesses, most notably the banking sector, but many, many others, which, again, our business team are very keen to cover. And then we go into an extraordinary general election, probably one of the closest, again, in living memory. The stakes, again, being high, the outcome uncertain. We have the likelihood that the Conservatives will pull back, that there's a narrow lead to Labour of 3 points, but with a growing economy, that road, normally speaking, would go in the course of a general election. But there is a complicating factor, again, on a story that this newspaper has followed very well, I think, from the beginning. The rise of a strange fourth party in UKIP that we recorded only a couple of weeks ago, that for the first time was in the lead in the European elections. Now, one may discount those and just say this is the British public having their fun before the serious business of 2015, but it's not. I mean, we've seen how third-party candidates in the United States have affected the course of events in extraordinary ways. I mean, Bill Clinton probably would have never been elected had it not been for a third-party candidate that edged out his rival, President George Bush. So in this country, we're coming up to an extraordinary event where it's possible that the Conservatives might win more votes and lose the election partly because of the of UKIP. So it's a great moment for us. And once again, I'd like to thank you all for coming here, and stay with us. Watch us. Watch what we do, because you'll find out what happens, whether it's both in financial news and political news, that this is the place to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good. Well, now, the reason for today is that we're going to tell you about something very special, a very special event which is happening this year. As Martin alluded to, it is our 50th birthday. It seems hard to believe now, in an era where of wall-to-wall coverage and 24/7 business coverage in particular, that the Sunday Times had the very first standalone business section on Fleet Street. It was in September 1964. The editor then was a guy called Dennis Hamilton, who was really quite a visionary. 2 years earlier, he'd had a great success with Britain's first colour magazine, what's now the Sunday Times weekend magazine. That had been a great success, and he sensed change in the air. You know, we were coming out of post-war austerity, there were new social freedoms, new kinds of people around. Old authority was being challenged. He sensed something similar in business and thought it would be a great idea if there was a standalone business section. It's very interesting looking back into the company archives at the memos from the time. He was told in no uncertain terms that, well, certainly there would be no business news on a Sunday. What a ridiculous idea. Advertisers certainly would not be interested. And anyway, isn't business very boring? It's a kind of a subject off over there. Hamilton, thankfully, just went straight over the top of the naysayers and launched it anyway. And it was a huge critical success. It really changed the way that business journalism was done. And looking back again, as I have done over the coverage of the last 50 years, I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say that the Sunday Times business section really invented modern business journalism. Remember, in 1964, these were the days before the FTSE 100, before economic forecasts had taken place in Britain, before even corporation tax. So this was a very bold and new development. It was also, funnily enough, a huge commercial success. Advertisers absolutely loved it. They also knew that something was changing and this was a vehicle that they could back. And as Martin alluded to, that success continues today. There was an Ipsos Mori survey last year of business readership. It's done roughly every 2 years. We've done very well for the last 10 years. Last year we did even better. Nearly 60% of all executives read the Sunday Times. It's a long way back to any other day, any other weekly. The Economist did about 23%, and we're roughly double the readership of any of the dailies. So today we have some fantastic speakers. Andrew Lynch will tell you what we're going to do in September. We're planning a one-off magazine, and Andrew will give you a rundown of what the contents of that will be. David Smith is going to talk us through some of the ups and downs of the British economy over the last 50 years, and it has been a roller coaster ride. And then Ian Cowie will talk to us about what's happened in personal finance, a complete revolution in the way that people deal with their own money and the way they plan for their future. Our idea in doing all this and bringing this first to you is that we see you as sort of important messengers for us to go out and spread our word and what we're doing amongst the wider business community. So we think for us you're a very important audience, and thanks for coming along. And hopefully we will provide you with some ideas that will pique the interest of your clients along the way. At the end we'll come back to me and I'll open it up for questions. I should say we're in for a fire alarm test at 9 a.m. We'll sort of stutter through it the best we can. Now over to Andrew about what's going to be in the magazine.
Right, thanks, Dominic. Sexual intercourse. Yeah, I thought that might get a few laughs. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, as Philip Larkin wrote. I'm sure the English literature students will remember. And that was fantastic, because it gave our readers something to do until September 1964, when the business news came out. More to the point, we don't normally do anniversaries at the Sunday Times. This year we've made an exception because we think we have been, and we are, rather good at reporting business. And this is a chance that no one else has taken, as far as I know, and I've read a lot of books about it in the last 6 months, to put 5 decades of change in the business world into perspective. The main way we'll do this is with a special magazine, 50 Years of Business, which will be published on September the 28th, probably the day after the anniversary, as it were. In look and feel, it'll be much like our culture magazine section. The three main narratives will be from David on economics and Ian on personal finance, and then on business by Ben Lawrence, the former Financial Mail on Sunday, who's worked with us for about the past 10 years. Among the other features, and I don't suppose we're in danger of being scooped by anybody on this, is we'll be looking at the end of the trade union barons and probably a little bit about our part in their downfall. The changes in the cities that brought Big Bang and the demise of the individual British merchant banks. The rise of consumerism and television advertising, the British Mad Men, as it were. The rise of the entrepreneurs and how we all wanted to become a Branson. And managerial Britain. In '64, the permission was given for the first two business schools, London and Manchester, to start. And we'll probably talk a bit more about LBS after these speeches. And that's just the half of it, I hope. We've got the opportunity here, with your help, to create a compelling historical document that will appeal to school students as much as company chairmen. And I'll finish with a tribute, which will give you a little insight into our history. It's from Nigel Lawson, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I'd add a former rival as well as city editor of the Sunday Telegraph. I'm not quite sure I can sound as pompous as he is, but I'll give it a bash. He said in his memoirs, "Unfortunately, the pound was given a downward shove by a story in the Sunday Times, a paper to which the business world tends to pay exaggerated attention." That was on Sunday, January the 6th, 1985. And here's the author of that story that so wound him up, David Smith.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. And it's great to be having this first 50th anniversary event and to see so many of you here. I can tell you that I wasn't the author of that particular story. But I have been at the Sunday Times as economics editor for half of the 50 years. So I joined as economics editor in 1989. So 25 of the 50 years I've been economics editor. And I can see one or two shocked faces in the audience, people thinking he's too young. And you're right, I was only 14 when I started. But I can tell you, I mean, it's been a privilege to have been economics editor for the quarter of a century. And I can also say that when I was younger, I was a little bit older than 14 when I started. When I was younger, we always had the Sunday Times at home. I always looked at the business section, and the one job I wanted was Sunday Times economics editor. So I've managed to cling on to it for 25 years, which I think is a formidable achievement. Over that period, I often wonder, and I'm going to give you sort of 50 years of economic history in 5 minutes, whether Dennis Hamilton and the powers that be at the Sunday Times would have launched the business section in 1964 had they known what was coming. Because 1964, a time of great optimism, we just had a new government in, technology was to the forefront, the white heat of technology was going to transform our economy. The Wilson government, the Labour government of 1964, launched this new thing called economic planning, which sort of sounds vaguely Eastern European, and it was. But it was going to raise the growth rate. We're going to use technology. Many of the things we see around now were familiar. Of course, it didn't happen, although that was, by later standards, a pretty good time for the economy. The Wilson government spent years trying to stave off devaluation. It didn't succeed, and in 1967, as some of you will know, we had the famous devaluation of sterling when Wilson said to the British people, the pound may have been devalued, but the pound in your pocket has not been. Quite a complicated message to get across, and one which exposed him to a lot of ridicule subsequently. And for years after that, I think the 10th anniversary edition of the Sunday Times Business News had something, the headline which said something like, "What a terrible time to celebrate an anniversary," because we went through an enormous period of turbulence in the 1970s, probably until the recent turbulence we've seen in the financial crisis, the biggest period of turbulence we've seen in the UK economy. It included an inflation rate at one point of nearly 27%, It included the first emergence of mass unemployment since the war. It included the rescue of the UK economy in 1976 by the International Monetary Fund. We had been instrumental in setting up the International Monetary Fund in 1944. We were the first big economy to have to be rescued from it, by it. And it was a time of industrial anarchy, terrible industrial relations, terrible strikes and so on. And I suppose for that first 10, 15 years of the Sunday Times Business News, it was mainly reporting disaster. It was mainly reporting bad times for the economy. I happen to be writing a book about the economy. I've written a few before, but this one is called "Something Will Turn Up." Taking the Mr. Micawber phrase from Dickens, because something does turn up. Something always turns up. So the disaster of the 1970s was followed by the renaissance of the 1980s, and suddenly the UK economy grew. We had a productivity miracle. We had another miracle, I suppose, which was that in the 1970s, free enterprise was almost a dirty word in the UK. We had a union-dominated, a state-dominated economy. Enterprise, the private sector, free enterprise, came to the fore during the 1980s. And I think, despite some later setbacks, it has remained to the fore, which I think has been, ultimately and inevitably beneficial for the British economy and for all the companies for which we work. We've had other big moments since then. Shortly after I joined the Sunday Times, we had Black Wednesday and the ERM crisis. And it's interesting to think that if we hadn't had the ERM crisis, the ERM was the European exchange rate mechanism, which was a forerunner of the euro. Maybe if we hadn't had Black Wednesday, we might have been in the euro at this point. We had it, we were expelled from the ERM, and things turned out to be very differently. Things turned out to be, in fact, rather good. For the period from the early 90s to the eve of the financial crisis in 2008, we had the longest continuous period of economic growth in our history. So 16 years of non-stop economic growth. We look at with great care at the GDP figures when they come out these days, the quarterly GDP figures. There's always a certain amount of nervousness about whether they're going to be up or down, great emphasis on those figures. From that period, from the early 90s to 2008, the beginning of 2008, we had 66 consecutive quarters of rising quarterly GDP. Quarter in, quarter out, GDP rose. We've never seen anything like that before. The previous record was 19. We'll never see it again. We haven't seen it since the crisis ended. This was a formidable period of economic growth, followed, of course, by the biggest bust in modern times. And the 2008-9, well, 2007-9, we're just approaching the 7th anniversary of the beginnings of the global financial crisis. And that period, I suppose, for all of us involved in business and economic reporting, was the most exciting and scary that we've experienced. This was a time when we really were quite close to the edge. This was a time when people in the business section were in enormous demand, not just in terms of writing for all parts of the paper, but also from other journalists on the Sunday Times wanting to know whether it was safe to leave their money in the bank. This was a time of great concern, great uncertainty. It was a time when, the banking system almost collapsed, and by that I mean, it was a time when the cash machines almost didn't get refilled, supermarket shelves almost didn't get restocked, wages almost didn't get repaid. We almost didn't have a banking system. We almost didn't have an economy. So a time of great uncertainty, a time of intense excitement for reporting the economy, but as I say, a rather frightening time as well. Now we're into a recovery period. The crisis is some time behind us, and time is a great healer in those things. We're into a recovery period, and the recovery is gaining strength, and that's good news. I think you probably see that in all the businesses in which you work. But we're seeing some of the old arguments return. We're seeing some of the old arguments return in the political context. Should the railways be renationalised? Should we have rent controls? Should you have price controls on energy and other things? And, 50 years of reading Sunday Times Business News would probably tell you that those things don't work. Sometimes we need a bit of history to know the lessons of the past tell us that some things probably aren't going to work in the future. Our message, I think, at the moment, and the picture at the moment is very optimistic. It's good to be celebrating the 50th anniversary in better times than we celebrated the 10th anniversary all those years ago. And we would encourage you, it's going to be an exciting year for us, but I think it's an exciting time going forward beyond this year. We'd encourage you all to stay with us and to take that journey with us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, David. You made me remember something. One of the features that we will also have in our magazine is the former business editors writing about what really happened, the stories that they can finally tell. And David talked about the great drama around the collapse of the banks. My predecessor, John Waples, in the piece that he will write for us, will talk about a very dramatic dinner he had in, I think it was September or possibly October 2008. Royal Bank of Scotland was at death's door. Then Sir Fred Goodwin had been in the Treasury all day trying to hammer out rescue terms for the bank, and he was going to have dinner with John that night. Fred walked in the door and John said, "How's it going, Fred? Is everything going to be okay?" And Fred just looked at him and said, "Well, it's a little bit gritty," which is a fantastic piece of understatement for one of the biggest corporate collapses ever. Now we'll turn to personal finance. Ian.
Back then, as now, the Sunday Times was ahead of the game when it launched its business section in 1964. The 50 years that followed saw the creation of a home-owning, shareholding Britain. Families which had never owned bricks and mortar or stock market investments half a century ago now typically own both. So financial journalism changed from being something of interest for the few to news you can use for most of us. These were also decades when personal taxation rose and then fell, as did rates of inflation. At the same time, we saw the welfare state expand and then contract, most notably in the area of pensions. Back in the 60s, most people relied on the state or paternalistic employers to look after them in old age. Today, at least in the private sector, rising numbers of people realise that if we don't save for our old age, nobody else will do the work for us. That makes some understanding of how asset prices performed in the past useful when making plans for the future. It provides a factual basis upon which to attempt to predict the unpredictable. For example, if you'd been asked in 1964 which store of value would deliver the highest total returns over the next half century, you might well have opted for property. While only 43% of the population owned their home back then, the aspiration to do so was already widespread. It proved a profitable passion because the national average house price soared from less than £3,000 half a century ago to stand at £175,000 today, according to the Nationwide Building Society. In other words, bricks and mortar turned every £100 back then into more than £5,800 today. Even after allowing for the illusory effect of inflation, that's a pretty good return. The Bank of England reckons you would need nearly £18 today to equal the purchasing power of £1 in 1964. Perhaps more surprisingly, bricks and mortar were not the top performing asset class during the last half century. Gold and gilt-edged stock both did better, and shares reflecting the changing composition of the London Stock Exchange did best of all. Barclays kindly updated their annual equity gilt study to analyse savings and investment returns since the Sunday Times business section was launched, and Bullion Vault provided precious metal prices. For example, £100 left on risk-free deposit for 50 years would have rolled up into more than £3,800 in nominal terms in a bank or building society account. Meanwhile, gold turned £100 into nearly £6,200, while gilts delivered £6,700. But out ahead by a country mile, shares turned the same sum into nearly £27,000. Even after inflation is stripped out, that's a real return of more than £1,400 on every £100 invested. True, the housing figures take no account of gearing. In plain English, most people can borrow heavily to buy housing when credit is harder to come by to invest in shares. Nor do nationwide stats include the financial benefit from avoiding rent by owning your own home. There is also the problem of survivorship bias, where stock market indices forget shares that fell by the wayside. But it is important, it's also important to be aware that equity investors had to earn their outperformance, as David and Dominic were saying earlier, by weathering some spectacular economic storms. The oil crisis and miners' strikes led to the 1974 stock market crash, which caused some to question the future of capitalism. Black Monday 1987 prompted similar fears, although the FTSE 100 actually ended that year marginally higher than it began.
Please. Attention, please. The fire alarm test is now complete. Please respond to all future fire alarms.
Okay. Today, the FTSE remains lower in capital terms than the all-time peak of 6,930. It reached in December 1999, just before the dot-com bubble burst. This index of Britain's biggest shares has fallen by more than 40% twice this millennium, including the global credit crisis from which we seem to be recovering now. Despite all these shocking setbacks, it's been a very profitable half-century for most homeowners and investors. That's a positive message which I hope your clients will help us tell, because the historic facts can put our present troubles in perspective. Popular capitalism was the name given to these long-term trends by Margaret Thatcher, who, as it happens, was first elected Prime Minister 35 years ago this week. Whatever your politics, wider home ownership, now including nearly 2/3 of adults, and deeper stock market investment, mostly via defined benefit pensions and other pooled funds or platforms, means more people have good reason to seek accurate financial reporting and intelligent analysis. Peter Hargreaves, Anthony Bolton and Jim Slater are among the prominent figures from the last half-century of financial services who've already contributed their thoughts on what the past might teach investors today about the future. I hope that you and your clients will participate in this project. After all, two views make a market, and the more the merrier, so that we can publish analysis that readers of the Sunday Times business section find interesting and useful.
Thank you, Ian. So if you have clients in financial services, they will want to be reading exactly what Ian is writing about and has just described to you. Now, we'll throw it open for questions now. We've got a little bit less than half an hour for that. First of all, a couple of thoughts about how your clients might get involved. Two things occur to us. This is an idea we're sort of toying with. A lot of people write into us and say, we love the Sunday Times business section because I read it when I was a student, rather like David says, and that inspired me to go on and go into business, start my own company or whatever it is. We would like to hear from your clients who have those kind of stories to tell. I mean, we're going to get Pascal Soriot, the chief executive of AstraZeneca, to write one because he can say, oh my God, when the Sunday Times broke the story, I was in Australia and I realised I had to get back quick because Pfizer was coming. So if you have clients who have fond memories, who can say that the business section set them on to greater things, please get in touch because we'll run those in the paper as a kind of a promo in the run-up to the publication of the magazine in September. The other thing is that we are looking to raid company archives to show people online what the world of work was like over the ages 1964 and the successive years. We would love, for example, some fantastic footage from financial services clients about what it was like working in the city in 1964. Bowler hats, umbrellas, 9 till 3, all that kind of thing. You know, it's very hard to get hold of that kind of stuff, but it is living in company archives. And also, and that goes for the car industry, for any industry you can think of. What was work like then, and how has it changed? People love that stuff, and they will look at it online.